We have this big announcement to make. If you are watching this, it is happening in real time. What's the announcement, Ari?
Well, the announcement is that we are officially launching Solo Grants. The world is a collection of passion projects. I mean, look around you. Almost everything you see was created by someone who cared about something almost more than anyone else. We think that a world where more passion projects are being pursued is a better one, and because of that, we're launching Solo Grants, an initiative to fund more passion projects by people who want to see something new in the world. Oftentimes, things require teams, but it only takes one person to get started. To date, we funded over 50 people working on projects ranging from discovering and naming 3 new viruses to deploying wildfire prediction systems in California and Texas, even raising $10 million to bring ML to chip design. All of them got started with $1,000 or less. So if you're building something you're excited about and need some support to get things going, apply now at sologrants.com. And Solo Grants is kind of the reincarnation, the continuation, the evolution of this program that we've been running for the past year and a half, 2 years, where we have been giving grants to just really exceptional young talent across the world, excited about building really technically compelling projects.
It's really exciting. We'll get into the backstory of Merge and sort of how we came to even be working together on this. But before we do, what distinguishes someone who gets a solo grant from somebody who maybe is starting a startup typically?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is substantial distinction in some ways. I think that for us specifically, when it comes to solo grants, it is in no way required that you're building this to reach some sort of venture scale outcome. It does not even necessarily have to be a business.
In fact, most of the time it isn't a business.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important. I think that's really important, especially for the age range that a lot of the people who receive these grants are in. I think that venture is obviously a great model. It's incredible for people who are wanting explicitly to pursue venture scale businesses. But when you're young and you're getting started, I think that there's something really magical about the sort of frame of mind where this is an exploration. This is something that is a technical sort of venture. And it can be something that is genuinely novel and really innovation driven. It could be something that's a remixing of a bunch of different technologies to bring something to the world that hasn't been seen yet before. And I mean, a lot of these things do become businesses eventually, but I think it's important that they're not going into it with the idea that, okay, every decision I make has to go through the filter of how does this become profitable? How does this become a business? And I think, we've spoken a lot about quaint ideas, how some of the most exceptional businesses start as very quaint ideas that seem, completely almost laughable when you see them sort of, years later, raising venture and IPOing and doing whatever. So I would say that's the main distinction.
I think the other thing that's worth noting here, just for sake of completeness, is that this is not explicitly for young people. It is for anyone who wants to pursue a technically ambitious idea and is doing so not necessarily as a startup, but as a personal interest. The reason that it typically tends to go towards younger people getting the grants is because it's a small amount of money for somebody who's maybe been working for a long time. So typically the grants are anywhere from hundreds to $1,000 that we give. And I think there's also something really interesting, of course, which is that not only are we giving grants, but we're also a mechanism for people to discover sort of what I would like to describe as the wide world of grants. There's so many amazing grant programs out there. And ultimately, we like to not just support people with grants themselves, but also to forward people who have promising projects or ideas to the people who are actually best suited to help them go the distance with their project. So maybe you could speak a little bit about sort of what Merge started as, which is, just for people who are listening or watching, Merge was sort of our initial idea that we started maybe a year and a half ago. and sort of talk about how we started with Merge, and then we can talk about how we sort of made the evolution from saying, hey, Merge is actually solo grants, and we just never gave it that name until now.
Yeah. It's an interesting space. Like this sort of grant, micro grant, non-dilutive capital space is an interesting one. I think it's pretty quiet, especially when you look at the kind of like outcomes and interesting things people are working on. And I think that right now, it's a little bit different, but it's still the case. Especially when we got started, all of these different programs were very sort of separated and siloed off in their own kind of areas, and there was a lot of overlap in interest in projects. Like you would even see, two people working on a very similar project. They had received grants from two separate programs within a month of each other, and they had no idea that each other existed. Oftentimes in the same country or the same state. And that seemed kind of crazy to us, I think. And so Merge initially was really the idea that there are all of these incredibly talented people that are receiving non-dilutive capital to build out these projects. It's crazy that they're not all in the same place, able to sort of cross-pollinate ideas and relationships and build together. And I think like that was the first idea.
That's really cool. So the idea of Merge was not just give our own grants, but actually bring people together who've received these grants from various places like Emergent Ventures or 1517, and bring them all together so they could know each other. And then also for people who are looking for grants, be that routing layer for microgrants. Microgrants specifically because, grants could go up to hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, depending on what kind of grants we're talking here. We're specifically talking about microgrants. So before we sort of talk about that transition from Merge to solo grants and kind of the insight there, talk to me a little bit about what microgrants actually are.
Yeah. So this changes a ton program to program. Like you mentioned Emergent Ventures 1517. I think a microgrant can start in the hundreds of dollars. It can be extremely small. And I think that a lot of people, when they hear that, they probably write it off to a certain extent. And I think they write it off unless they are actually in the position where a microgrant is maybe not, it could be life-changing. In a lot of cases, it actually is. But it may not seem it. But it certainly is trajectory changing with the project itself and oftentimes sort of the lifetime of that project and what they go on to do afterward. And it can scale up from small hundreds to thousands to hundreds of thousands of millions. 1517, for example, is a venture fund, but they set aside sort of a small portion of that fund every year to give out in these $1,000 checks.
These are non-dilutive.
These are completely non-dilutive.
There's no right to invest or anything like that. It's just, and again, they're not giving people money explicitly for businesses.
Yes.
They're giving people money for interesting, wacky ideas.
Exploration.
Yeah,
completely. I think that's like the real, it is 100% no strings attached. That's what a grant really means. And then, we see programs like Emergent Ventures that are doing 5,000 to 50,000. O'Shaughnessy Ventures has a grant program and O'Shaughnessy especially goes into other sort of like creative areas in addition to technology projects. It's like $100,000, $10,000. And so, and we also see models like the Thiel Fellowship. I mean, really the Thiel Fellowship is kind of a grant program with like a support layer wrapped around it. Mm-hmm. So it's like a broad space, but the core mechanism there stays consistent across the board.
And the Thiel Fellowship was actually started by Danielle and Michael, who are at 1517 now, and of course Peter Thiel. And the original premise of the Thiel Fellowship has kind of changed a little bit over time to what it is today. The original premise was drop out of school. You have no money probably because you haven't started a company yet. So we're going to give you money to actually work on some idea that in theory could be much more valuable than what you do in school. And there were a lot of great things that came out of that. I think that the most notable one that most people are aware of is Ethereum. Vitalik Buterin was a Thiel Fellow, but there were so many.
Figma?
Yeah, so that's the other thing. There were all these great companies that came out of it as well. Ethereum is sort of more of a project. I mean, there's the Ethereum Foundation and lots of business has been built on top of it. But the whole premise was something that was explored in a way that I think that would have been done differently had he had to go out and raise venture capital, for instance. So I think that there's something really interesting about that. And of course, Thiel Fellows have gone on to create all these wonderful companies. And now when you look at the Thiel Fellowship, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are actually getting the Thiel Fellowship after they've already dropped out of school and after they've already raised money. Not to say that there's anything wrong with that. These are great founders. Augustus from Rainmaker, as an example, he got into the Thiel Fellowship after he left school and was working on Rainmaker full time. He's a fantastic solo founder. We'll be having him on the show at some point in the near future. We've been talking about doing an El Segundo trip, but yeah, I think there's something really wonderful about sort of the origins of the Thiel Fellowship and then how it led to 1517, where they're continuing to do this grant giving. Maybe you could share a little bit about the realization that what we were doing at Merge was actually solo grants by another name, and us deciding that, wow, we have to really need to relaunch this and announce it with the framing of, this is primarily for solo builders.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see, I think in Merge, what we start to see was the very like real-time disintegration of the idea that you needed to get started with a co-founder. I think that was really interesting because a lot of the people who were building in Merge, whether we had given them a grant ourselves or they had joined the community and received funding from other programs, a lot of them were building projects for the first time. And it did not even occur to them that they should necessarily go out and find a co-founder. It was not something that we were selecting for. It was really something that we saw kind of looking back. And I think that's really kind of incredible when we see now what we're doing with solo founders.
The thing, I forget who said this, but this idea that the world is a series of passion projects, right? Passion projects are very often done from one person's passion, right? It is sometimes, it's amazing when there are people who come together and co-create ideas, and some of the great things that have been made have multiple creators, of course. But there's something to be said about, when people are working on a passion project, they don't think, oh, I need to have a passion project co-founder, right? So the co-founder idea is really something associated with businesses, with startups. And when they're in the passion project frame, it never even occurs to someone to have that, right? Now, maybe they happen to know someone or they want to work with someone, and that happens. But if you look at most grants and most grantees and most of the projects that they're working on, they don't have collaborators, or they get the grant and then they find collaborators. So it really is sort of, as you were saying, this model of building solo that doesn't have that sort of baggage or bias that is created by, the existing sort of maybe lore around startups.
Yeah.
The startup lore is you get a co-founder, you go and raise some money, maybe you talk to customers afterwards.
Yep.
I'm just kidding. But you eventually build this great company and you have your co-founder. With passion projects, it's almost always about somebody sitting alone at their typewriter or at their easel or in their garage. It's about the tinkerers and the explorers. And oftentimes, because the ideas that they're working on are pure interest plays, they're not businesses, it's really just about appealing to yourself and not appealing to other people.
Yeah. And I think that there are a lot of things that we can sort of like extrapolate from that. One of which that comes to mind is like this idea that if you build for yourself, you're in a way building for many. I think a few episodes back, maybe this was Eugenia, she had a similar kind of, she spoke about a similar thing. And I think like that applies here too. And also I think it's important that people do take the time to explore these passion projects and go on these explorations. And in the event that they do become excellent businesses, I think a lot of times it can be traced back to the fact that not a lot of people are necessarily getting started on business ideas truly as just an exploration and as a passion project. Like they were probably on relatively uncharted territory thinking about the things they were thinking about before they realized it could be applied in that more business way.
I also think there's something really valuable about not optimizing immediately to figure out, is this a business, when you can discover more interesting businesses that way, right? You can find a great business idea specifically by just exploring things that are of interest and discovering something along the way. If the only way to discover the business idea is through this sort of free range exploration of something that doesn't actually seem like a business, it actually means that you're probably going to be one of the few people who ever discovers it. So therefore it is a business that is unique versus something where, you're going to have like 5 YC companies cloning you the next day, right? Yeah. There is just so much to be said about coming to interesting ideas through something other than how do I find a startup idea, right? How to find a startup idea is generally a bad thing to do if you're optimizing for that. And I think that the best advice around it is look to your own personal experiences, right? Well, if you don't have many personal experiences yet, especially if you're younger, how do you actually create personal experiences? Well, you work on passion projects, right? And that's specifically what solo grants and the wider world of grants exists to do. Now, I think that there's something that's really worth talking about specifically around solo grants, which is this idea that there should be more people working on passion projects, right? And I think that there are probably 2 reasons that I can think of, primarily why people aren't doing that. I'd love to hear what other ones you have. The first 2 that come to mind for me are, one, oftentimes the gap between working on a passion project and not is some very small, relatively speaking, amount of money for a large portion of the population. So you were just saying, well, hundreds of dollars, for somebody who's maybe worked in tech for a number of years, hundreds of dollars, you can't even imagine maybe if you're sort of removed from sort of the average person, like you can't even imagine that that's a lot of money or that's a gap that needs to be filled. But the reality is there's so many people where if you give them a couple $100, it's the gap between them pursuing that passion project and not. And I think if you actually want to help more people pursue passion projects, it's about closing the gap. And then the other piece is role models, right? If you show people that there is a way to go out there in the world and work on projects, they don't need to be instantly monetizable. You don't need to try and figure out some app that you can pump UGC content to drive traffic to and then have a paywall and then get consumers to pay for it. Like, that's fine. I'm not trying to knock people who do that sort of thing, but there's so much more in the world than that. And if you can ultimately help people go out there and make the things that are representative of their interests versus just sort of some kind of cookie cutter, follow what everybody else has done approach. Well, that allows people to see, wow, I can do that. And not only can I do that, but there's actually a support system for that. And there's infrastructure for that. And that's pretty cool as well. But I think the high level here is if we actually help more people work on their passion projects in the world that are real interests and especially technical interests, we're going to see such an incredible return on that. Not as investors or anything like that, though certainly if people were to invest in, people who are working on some of these things and converting them to business, 1517 is a great example of doing that and it working well. But I think it's more from the actual side of, what actually benefits the world, right? We will benefit the world so much when the world will benefit so much, I should say, when we have more people working on passion projects. In fact, my hope with things like AGI and all of this is that it will free up people's time to work on like truly novel passion projects, and AI, of course, will be a lever to help them make more progress on that.
Yeah.
I'm curious if there are other thoughts that you have, based off of those premises. If there's anything else that you think that kind of like solo grants unlocks for people.
Well, I mean, to the thing that what you said about how like a few $100, it can oftentimes be the thing that unblocks a person, reminded me of is Arian. He was one of our first grantees. To this date, one of the only times we looked at the application and we looked at the amount of money that he was requesting, and then when we got on the call, he asked for, I think it was like $100 less. And I think the reason for that, it had, maybe had been a few days in between the application and the interview, and he had found a way to get even scrappier and build out the idea. But the reality with Arian's project was that he was building the world's largest database of phage viruses, which is it's an insane thing, to like decide to build, especially I think he was 19, when we gave the grant. And we covered his Airtable like costs. That's all it took. That's what he was using to host all of these, the images and the information on each of these phages. And from that point, he then, continued doing phage virus research. He discovered and named 3 new viruses. I mean, he's doing incredibly well. And it started with $100, $150, crazy.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that was the main thing that reminded me of. But I think it's also like a lot of these explorations don't necessarily fit into specific, like a single interest group that certainly probably isn't popular with their existing friends or their community or the family. Sometimes it is, and that's great, but it's not frequently the case. And I think that having a single person or a couple of people, get on a call and not only express interest, but also sort of give them this small amount of money to go and pursue this interest is very validating. And I think that creates like a sort of snowball effect where it's not just them working on this. It's like, okay, these 2 people or this one person on the call, they think this is a great idea too. So not only, do I think it's worth doing, but there are other people that agree with me. And I think like when you're just getting started, that's like a really outsized impact.
So something that was really interesting and sort of full circle about us working on this is, ultimately, we got working together a year and a half, 2 years ago, or at least we first met because of all the stuff you were doing online and because you had actually received a microgrant yourself. So maybe we can talk about sort of the early days of what was going on in your life, like how you actually came to discover microgrants, what microgrants have done for you, and then we can talk about kind of the history of how we ended up working on this.
Cool. Yeah, I was in high school. I was interested in so many different things. All of which, for the most part, at a certain point required, some money to get started. It was never a lot, but it was more than I had access to at least. And I think the first encounter I had with the concept of a grant was when I was building a Discord server called Builder Group, and we were wanting to host our first hackathons. I remember that we were trying to figure out ways to accept money. We couldn't incorporate because we were minors, and there was all of this stuff that we were having to figure out. And the first grant that we got actually was not even from a fund. It was from a guy. He was a founder. He had just like sold his startup to Dropbox. And I think he gave us like $500, and it was, very casual. We just sort of bumped into him. We shared what we were working on. He really dug it, and he was like, okay, like what's blocking you right now? And that came up, and he was happy to do it. And then we got a grant from 1517, coincidentally, to sort of support the same project. But closer to you and I working together, I was working on a biotech project, and like hardware was really the main thing that we needed. We needed transducers, and we needed rice because it was a food tech project, and we needed all sorts of chemicals and proteins. And again, we needed some money. And I think at that stage, I wasn't really sure what this project was. I knew that it was for the greater good. I knew that regardless of whether we were successful with this project or not, the research that we were doing would become useful, and we should document it regardless. And I wasn't, certain enough in the idea necessarily to go out and turn this into a business yet. Like, that's for sure. And so I looked at other options, and I ended up submitting an application to Emergent Ventures. And that was a really eye-opening process as well, because they were actively supportive of the idea even more than I was in terms of the cash that I was asking for. I got on the call and I explained the sort of ambition of the project, and they started pulling threads a little bit and saying like, well, why aren't you maybe getting some flights out to India? Why aren't you, going sort of the extra mile? Like, why don't you really give this the attention and the money that it deserves? And so they ended up giving a little more than I had even asked for. And I think that goes back to the belief thing. The cash was incredible as an unblocker, but the belief in and of itself was equally substantial.
It's interesting too, because I think in a lot of ways people might say, oh, how do you actually spend less money, right? Yeah. But in the case of Emergent Ventures, this was Tyler.
This was Shruti. She runs the NTA program.
So she said, hey, instead of cutting your budget back, what would happen if you actually were more ambitious? Yeah. So I think that there's something to be said about how could we actually raise people's ambitions. And, if somebody's saying, well, I can do this if I had $0, or I could do this if I had, this amount of money. We want to say, well, do both. Like, do the thing, start out, like get started. Don't wait around for money if you could actually make some progress. But do not put a cap on your ambitions, especially if it's just, a relatively small amount of money that these microgrant programs exist for. And Solo, we have an entire Solo grants. We have an entire directory for you to browse and look at all of the microgrants. You could read about people who've had experiences getting the different microgrants. We of course give out our own microgrants, but there's just so much out there to support people who are building their passion projects solo or otherwise. Like the cool thing about our microgrant guide is it shows you which ones will actually give grants to people, even if you have people that you're working with. Because we're not trying to say, hey, you can't get funding to work on your project. We just want to route you to the right people to help with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe you could tell a quick story about sort of how you ended up building the largest photography Discord, which I think is pretty cool. And then also, how do we meet? Like, what's the backstory there? Because I think that it's an interesting illustration of what happens when you put things out into the world, and also when you're primarily on places like X, where you can meet people and have sort of serendipity take place.
Yeah, I mean, the backstory here, it ties into a lot of what we've already spoken about in a way. I started this Discord server when I was 15. It was the middle of the pandemic, and I was living abroad with family, and so I was extremely isolated. And one of the things that I was most interested in at the time was photography, and I basically just wanted to meet more photographers. And I was on Discord a lot. I was thinking, why aren't there communities for photographers on Discord? I know it's a gaming platform primarily, but I just thought I'd give it a shot. And I think that what ended up happening there was a big mix of really good timing, serendipity, and kind of accidentally just falling into something that resonated with what people wanted. It did not start out going, sort of to the moon. It did not it was not, some sort of crazy high growth situation from day one. But it kind of felt like the doors were opening as I made progress on that a little easier than past things I had done. And so I knew that I wanted to continue doing it in addition to my just wanting to make new friends. And so it was, I would just promote it in different places on the internet, create different channels, think about what people wanted on Discord to sort of not only meet other photographers, but maybe showcase their photography. And it actually turned 6 years old on July 4th. So with America's birthday, it was also Photography Lounge's birthday. And I mean, it's at 40,000 members, and those 40,000 members send over 10,000 messages a day. And it's just sort of bloomed into this thing that I have no control over anymore, and is mostly managed by this incredible team that has built out completely volunteer based over the past few years. So that was my introduction to community building online, seeing things kind of work in a very organic way, and later technology. And so a couple years after I had started that, I was building more communities online specifically for technology and young people getting started coding and designing and starting companies. And I think we released a resource hub called Builder Book, which was really just a one-stop shop where we had articles that we had written. We had guest authors writing articles, everything from immigration to filing your 83Bs after incorporating your company to design. And I put that up on Twitter. We spent a ton of time on the launch video. This was before the sort of really fancy launch videos. We spent a lot of time on the website designing it, and it resonated with people. And I think that it was a good sort of evergreen resource. I think that's how you came across the work that we were doing initially. And so in the year that followed, I started building this biotech project. And I think that I reached out at some point and was looking for advice on some things and feedback. And so when I had graduated high school and I was trying to figure out what was next, do I go to university? Do I try and build UltraRice into this other thing? We started talking about microgrants. And I think that we really just like gelled on that. I think we both agreed that there needed to be this unblocking sort of mechanism in a much bigger way in technology, but also, across the board. And that just like would not have happened if I hadn't been exploring these things that I was very passionate about, putting them out on the internet, iterating on them, building them out over time. And yeah, I mean, it's incredible to think, really. Yeah.
It's funny because when we were messaging, I think we probably messaged a bunch back and forth over maybe like 6 months. And then it just so happened that I was visiting family.
Yeah.
And it turned out you were about 45 minutes drive from where my family was, which is crazy. I mean, out of all the places you could have possibly been. So we met up. Yep. We hung out for 4 hours?
Yeah,
5 hours,
crazy
really
long
time.
Yeah.
Walking all over. And afterwards we were just like, well, we got to work on something together. It's just a matter of what and how. We started working on what became Merge. You've worked on ODF over the years. You've done lots of interviews for ODF. You've done admissions. You now do media for solo founders. You are really just sort of dynamic. You kind of handle a lot of different things. But the thing that we really bonded on originally was Merge. And the idea of microgrants and sort of the potential that they have to sort of increase collective ambition, in the world. And it's just really cool to see sort of now we're coming full circle with we launched Solo Founders. We made this claim that solo founders are not only underestimated and considered odd, but we believe that they're the future. They're the default way of starting companies going forward. And we also believe that the best way to get more great things built in the world, not necessarily just businesses, but more great things, more great discoveries, is through microgrants.
Yeah.
It's this way of increasing people's ambitions, causing them to have a community. We didn't really talk about this part, but there is a community associated with all of this. And the idea that if you can find your people who are also building solo, you're doing it, you're working on your projects solo together, right? Yeah. Which is the whole idea of everything we do with solo and communities. And when you bring those things together, you are able to accomplish more than maybe you would have ever imagined otherwise. I think it's just a really wonderful thing. I'm so excited to be launching this today. Maybe before we go, another example is like, our other like collaborator on all of this is Kai Goodall. And Kai is a Canadian, but we don't hold that against him. I'm just kidding, Kai. Why don't you say a little bit about Kai, how we got to meet him, how we ended up working with him on solo grants and prior to that Merge, and also maybe share a little bit more about what it's like working with somebody who's still in college. You decided not to go to college. Kai is in college. He's doing all sorts of amazing things up at Waterloo. But yeah, share a little bit more about Kai.
Yeah, I mean, Kai, it's amazing thinking about all of these relationships that have sort of woven themselves through the past few years. Kai and I met initially at TKS, the Knowledge Society. It's like a teen sort of accelerator for STEM. And we met online, had sort of casual discussions. I think we both found each other interesting. And he had received a grant from 1517 to build a rocket-propelled skateboard. Which, it's one of those projects where you hear it, you read it again, and it's consistently like shocking and epic. And I just think that was sort of the moment I was like, okay, like this guy, like he's working on some pretty cool things. But Kai is just, is like basic or sort of like resident rocket scientist. He's really deep in rocketry at the University of Waterloo now. And we decided to work on this together because between the fact that he's deeply embedded in this sort of community of young people working on these technical projects, he himself is a hardware builder. He himself received a microgrant to build this project. I think it made sense. And I mean, Waterloo University is just a very interesting, like, sort of pool of talent, especially in hardware, but kind of across the board. And I think, the team went to Waterloo Symposium last year or the year before, and saw all these crazy projects that people were working on. I think that's really a great example of what examples can do. And sort of how like the power of inspiration and seeing other people doing similar things to what you want to do at some point. And Kai is just a good embodiment of that. He's a good communicator. He's done a lot of these things before. So he's been doing great. He's, doing interviews and applications and helping grow the program.
It's amazing. I think that Kai is such a great complement to, the rest of the team. And he's just done such a wonderful job selecting amazing people for solo grants. This is super exciting. I think that the thing that we didn't get to talk to too much, but I think that we'll have an entire write-up if you look at the show notes, is sort of all of the grants we've given so far to date. So many incredible people who are building their projects solo. You'll be able to go and view all of the projects on the website, check it out. And then, of course, if you are looking for a small amount of funding or even maybe a slightly larger amount of funding, for your project, you should definitely go to our website and check it out, because we not only are giving out solo grants, but we are also helping route you to the people who are the perfect people to be supporting your project. So if you're watching this, we'd love to have you on the website, checking it out, giving us feedback, and of course, applying. Anything else you want to say to the group who's watching right now?
I'm excited to see your application. If this sounds like something that'd be exciting for you. And we're going to continue to be posting updates. It'll be great.
Amazing. Well, if you're watching that, I hope that you'll check out the website. And yeah, thanks again for being here, Ari, and coming out from behind the camera and talking about solo grants.
Yeah, this is great.